Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. We've got a terrific panel that we've assembled to just talk about technology for mental health and more specifically, technology to help people who are recovering from traumatic stress issues. So, I'd like to introduce our panelists here one at a time. So we've got a terrific group joining us. Marla, good morning. Where are you joining us from today?
Good morning. I'm joining you from Chicago, and it is
Chicago.
beautiful.
And tell us a little bit about your background.
So currently, I'm working with the Cook County Department of Public Health, and I'm working as a program manager as well as training specialist, helping with their contact tracing initiative. So right now, what we're trying to do is to help continue to stop the spread of COVID, as well as to help with vaccines and also provide education to the suburban Cook County.
Terrific. Well, thanks for being here. And Michelle, where are you joining us from?
Hi, I'm joining you from the south suburbs of Chicago.
Terrific. And what should we know about your background?
Well, I have a master's degree in speech pathology, and I worked for over 25 years with groups of people who were tracheostomized and or ventilator dependent. But I'm currently working with Marla in the contact tracing initiative for Cook County Department of Public Health as a contact tracer, reaching out to people and trying to prevent the spread of COVID, but also providing information regarding treatments and vaccinations and
Yeah,
all other kind of goodness.
awesome. My mom was a public health nurse, so I have great admiration for anybody working in public health. And Craig, good morning.
Yeah, how are you? So I'm calling in today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am a digital health strategist and advisor, consultant and researcher with the Digital Mental Health Project. My consultancy, which brings together years of work that I've done as a digital health innovator in the life sciences industry, and also my work as a mental health and wellness educator, advocate, and caregiver. So it's good to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. And Yuval, where are you joining us from today?
Hello, everybody. I'm joining you from New York.
And what do we know? What do we need to know about your background and what brings you here?
So I'm a psychologist, a professor at Columbia University Medical Center, and director of the PTSD program at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia Psychiatry.
Perfect. Thank you for being here. And Marie, last but not least,
Hello,
where
Brett. I
where
am
where are you this morning, Marie?
in sunny California in the Bay Area.
Sunny California, same as me.
And my name is Marie, and I'm the founder and CEO of Akisa Health, a new startup that brings digital intervention apps to help people transform post-traumatic stress into resilience.
Terrific. So, it's we live in interesting times, as they say. That there's more awareness than ever before about mental health as an issue, mental health as a public health issue, and we've seen kind of interesting new ways that technology can be brought to bear across the whole spectrum of health stuff, all kinds of amazing innovations with regard to digital health, medical stuff, surgical stuff, and also mental health. And meanwhile, we've been through a couple of years here in this country that have been a little stressful. The COVID stuff that Marla and Michelle have been immersed in, and that a lot of families have had to deal with. And then on top of that, there was a lot of isolation that happened as a result of COVID, right? So a lot of kind of mental health issues surfaced just by virtue of the fact that people were suddenly very, very isolated. And if you go onto the App Store today, you'll find a lot of different apps that claim to help you with meditation or help you with sleep or help you with, a wide range of different issues. And, as is always the case, there's a lot of these that are purely bogus And there's a few others that are actually rooted in actual science and methodology and proven regimens and all the rest of that. And so I guess that's kind of the topic of our discussion this morning is, what is going on with regard to actual kind of actual use cases of digital technology in a way that can be applied to mental health issues and actually show dramatic improvements with regard to outcomes. So who wants to kick off that conversation? Craig looks like he's ready.
Yes, I'm happy to kick it off because one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing in my consultancy is continually scanning the digital mental health landscape and environment, both here in the States and abroad. And I should have also mentioned I'm actually a graduate public health student right now, and I'm the focus of my research in this area. So I took some time recently in preparation for this to go back and do a scan of the literature in order to get an appreciation of what research is showing us is most effective when it comes to digital interventions that are specifically related to trauma. And here I'm making a distinction between trauma and mental distress, disorder, and disability, where quite often what you hear is that trauma is an injury, but other of the, I'll call them mental disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, psychosis, are more like a disease, right? And so the same way that we don't, we have different therapies for a disease than we do for a cut or a bruise, and we need to think of trauma more like a cut or a bruise. So anyway, in looking at the literature, we see that EMDR, and I can never remember the eye, motion, and something else, coupled with or alongside computer and interactive cognitive behavioral therapy, actually happen to be the two forms or modes of therapy that are best documented and evidence-based when it comes to trauma. But understand that others include virtual reality, which is used to administer exposure therapy. And most of the work around this has happened within the Veterans Administration because of the soldier population. Teletherapy, when it's used for virtual face-to-face and where particular therapies like CBT or exposure therapy are administered. We also see digital games. There's this interesting case I found in two papers. Tetris, believe it or not, has actually been proven to have some effect on the reduction of intrusive traumatic memory. That was a real surprise to me. And then there are other games that use digitally supported mental imagery as a motivational tool in helping people to refrain. You might think of that as a sort of form of CBT, but delivered through a different type of channel. And then I think many of us who have delved into some of the less well-known interventions for trauma, we come across theater and storytelling actually as a way of helping people in their recovery through community and witness and being seen and affirmed. But we often don't think about how digital storytelling, which is all around us, right? Every day, we complain about how YouTube and TikTok can hurt and damage us, but we often don't consider that it's just a tool. That hammer can break a window or build a house. And we need to continue to get better and better at figuring out how to use things like digital storytelling as a way of supporting and creating catharsis and healing for those that suffer with trauma. So that's just a quick overview of some of the more popular therapies that I found in the literature. And I'll stop. I'm interested to hear what other people think about that.
Yeah, that's great, Craig. So Yuval, you're the academic here. You're the professor at Columbia. Give us your thoughts on what we've seen recently with regard to technology for mental health.
So let me start by saying that the need for digital mental health is greater than ever. If you look at the issue of prevalence or estimated prevalence of mental health disorders during COVID, they really skyrocketed with regard to anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And not that they were very low before. I mean, there are certain communities in our country that are chronically suffer from untreated mental health problems, especially people who are disadvantaged, minorities, veterans, and more.
Right.
So there is a need for more treatment and for better treatment. And because resources are limited with regard to face-to-face treatment, I mean, it's very hard to schedule an appointment now, whether in San Francisco, New York, or wherever. It's very, very hard. So I think the digital platforms can provide quite a bit in terms of access and easiness, and perhaps even cost effectiveness of those services. And Craig is right. I mean, the question is, at the end of the day, is what can be done digitally. So there is quite a bit that can be done, but I think we are at the stage now where it's not really clear, what is really out there, what is effective, what is working, and whether research has been done is what has been kind of offered to the public. So there is a lot to do in this area.
Right. So Marla and Michelle, so you all kind of touched on the issue of access and equity. And the two of you work in public health in Cook County, which is the second largest county in the United States. It's a county with a pretty broad socioeconomic spectrum, right? The entire spectrum. And, I think this issue of equity and access is an important one across all kinds of different sectors today. But I think particularly with regard to mental health, in the sense that, there are people who have the money and they have the connections to, go hire themselves a psychiatrist when they feel as if they're struggling with something. And there are an awful lot of people in this country who don't have that access. And I'm sure a lot of the residents in Cook County fit that description. And so, what have you seen with regard to ways in which technology can be used to address this issue?
I think what we've seen, especially with the COVID pandemic, was we were able to see extremely the disparities that not only the residents were experiencing, but also the disparities that our healthcare workers were experiencing.
Yeah.
And so it was twofold for us. So when we had contact tracers and case investigators that were assisting our residents, one of the main things that we were experiencing, number one, was the fact that here they were trying to help the residents and provide resources. And so we were seeing where there were a lot of resources that were not available, or they could not afford those resources, or we were dealing with an issue of just people feeling a sense of, how do I even go and talk to someone, because I'm feeling a sense of, wait a minute, do I feel as though I can actually speak to that person? Because there was a sense of, wait a minute, I may not understand what that person is going to say to me, or I might feel as though from an educational perspective that that person is going to speak down to me. So many people didn't want to even reach out to a therapist because of that. In addition, what we also started to recognize with our healthcare workers was there was a sense of trauma that they were experiencing. So when we talk about trauma-informed care, as they were addressing the needs of our residents, it was triggering issues that they themselves may not have recognized that they had happened to them in their lives in the past, or it was triggering things that they were currently going through. So what we tried to do here at Cook County was to start to do different types of mental health training for our staff. But what we also understood was you can't always get things in the moment. So a person can't stop in the middle of a call and say, wait a minute, I need to talk to my therapist. That's not going to happen. But where digital comes into play is after a call, if there is a digital technology application that I could go and use in between a call, that's where it can actually assist a contact tracer or a case investigator, or even someone who may be working at a job. That's when we started to see where digital could play a factor in that.
Well, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way before, but it's kind of therapy on demand, right? You push a button on your phone and you can get something helpful to you right there at that moment. That's really interesting. I never thought about it that way. Michelle, what do you have to say about this?
Well, I agree with Marla. I've had a lot of experience with mental health just because of family members and an experience with, my own child. But making those calls to people who are literally grasping at the last straw,
Yeah.
needing some help. I've had several calls in which, I got off the phone and I needed something because it was just so stressful. One of the great things with our department, the Cook County Department of Public Health, is that they created a resource team, and we went off, off script, so to speak, and developed our own team with resources, and that helps a lot. But then there's after the call where you get off the phone and you're talking to somebody who is telling you they don't want to live like this. That really puts a strain on you as the person who's reaching out to them. And we had several trainings where Marla was the go-to for doing the trainings, and sometimes just even having something silly where we just do some fun and games, but it was one of those things that was recognized that needs to be there because the people who are providing the support also need the support.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's not a lot of that out there.
Right. So Marla, you used a term that I don't think I've heard before. You said something like trauma-informed care. Is that what you said?
Yes.
So tell us what that means.
And so what we recognized was when you think about staff, they have traumas that they're dealing with. And these traumas are things that just in our day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people don't recognize what types of traumas people are going through just in day-to-day life. So if someone's dealing with systematic racism, if they're dealing with the different poverty issues that they're going through, if it is domestic violence, this is just typical traumas that people are living with day in and day out in their lives. And so work trauma, things that are happening in your work life. So these are just regular traumas. Now couple that with COVID. So there's regular traumas that people are dealing with. And now then you added COVID on top of that. So what we did was we had trauma-informed care training for our staff. And out of that, we recognized more mental health training that needed to be provided. And that was where we said, okay, we're listening to staff and what they're saying that they need. That's how we're developing our mental health supports. So something simple as our morning motivations. Every morning at 8:30 before they start, they get a morning motivation, whether it's about mental health, if it's about living a healthy lifestyle, if it is just offering exercise information. It's something to help staff based upon feedback that they've given us. So this was something that the Chicago Tribune did a write-up about, just about what we're trying to do, because we can't speak about it if we're not actually making it a daily part of how we are actively supporting our staff each and every single day.
Right. This is my morning motivation right now. So Marie, I'd like to bring you into this discussion. So Marie, you chose to found a company in this space. You chose to found a new startup, kind of developing digital technology for traumatic stress recovery and other mental health issues. So tell us kind of what brought you to that point.
A few different reasons converged last year. I suffered from PTSD for many years and eventually found solutions. I wanted to share them with everybody. One of them was EMDR. And I realized that there was a shortage of therapists. My friends were like, I couldn't even give the number of someone who was available. So I started looking at how can I translate this and make this accessible to people. This is one reason. But I think there is still, I was surprised about this, but there's still a lot of stigma with associated with seeking care in some communities, and I think the news tell us we are beyond this now, but it's not true. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking to a therapist. And the other reason is, Yuval knows this, and some of us know this. There is a dire shortage of therapists. Even, in LA, there was an article recently, even someone who was willing to pay $450 a session could not find someone. It's like psychiatrists don't take even, waiting lists anymore, because that's it. They're overbooked for 3 months, and they don't want to give the hope to someone that they are going to get onto a session anytime soon. So this is where therapy can help. It's not going to be the panacea, right? It will never completely replace a skilled therapist who has practiced for 20 years or 5 or 10 years, but it's a first step, right? It can be deployed. It can help people start processing, trauma. And the other thing is, when you look at the current situation of the world, right? I mean, the pandemic it's been really difficult for almost everybody, right? I mean, go look for the person who says, yeah, no, the pandemic, it didn't affect me, right? So mental health used to be, something that some people talked about in the past. Now everybody is talking about it. And when you look at the wars as well that are happening, even if we had therapists, you cannot deploy someone overseas in Ukraine to help all those refugees, right? You can develop an app. Most of the people have cell phones, or you can just ship cell phones, right? You can ship iPads. So you can deploy technology a lot more faster than you can deploy humans. And so this is another reason why I decided to launch Akessa, and I think technology is really going to help.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point, that you can't, you can't ship therapists into war zones. Well, you could, but it's probably not recommended. But you can ship, tablets and iPhones into war zones. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So Yuval, I assume that you, as an academic and a psychologist, I assume you agree with Marie that, an app isn't going to replace traditional therapy, at least not in the short run. But have you seen kind of examples of the ways in which, traditional talk therapy can be combined with digital technologies for better outcomes?
Well, let me argue here that at least half of the people with PTSD that received face-to-face treatment didn't recover from PTSD. So we are talking about stigma, issues of access, problem of equity. So only the minority of people seek mental health treatment. Of them, only the minority of them will access face-to-face therapy. And even then, about half of them, if they have PTSD or depression, will not be benefited from face-to-face therapy. And I'm saying it as a proud research clinician, and I love my work, but I always knew that that we are very short in what we can offer to the public in terms of effective, brief, cost-effective care. We are very short of that, and the government didn't help us. I mean, I got funding from a federal agency for years, but nevertheless, most of my ideas about more innovative research are very difficult to be funded, right? So how do you really push the envelope going out of the box? And I think what Marie and others are doing in this domain is important, because it can, as Marla was saying, it can be almost like a Peloton type of instrument, where you can do your walk-ups at 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. in the morning, if this is what you want to do, and experience the same experience as you are doing it in the morning or during lunch break, right? So first of all, you're doing it in your own terms, in your own space, in your own time. But secondly, the question of providing something complementary is really key to this discussion, right? So if we cannot heal everybody with our evidence-based treatments and evidence-based medications, we should look elsewhere in order to complement what we do to boost it, to address other domains in the brain, for example, in order to get a better effect. So that's really the context, I think, or the way I see the context of, digital apps and digital mental health, etc.
Yeah, that's great. And I like the Peloton comparison. My wife has a Peloton and she absolutely loves it. She's on it every day, and a big part of what keeps her doing it is that screen with the video of the instructor, right? That's a big part of what
Right.
motivates her to get on it every morning.
Right. And it doesn't matter to you whether the instructor is videotaped
Yeah.
or giving the session in real time. You get the same effect. So that's kind of interesting. However, Peloton lacks the online, on time, availability of a human being to provide advice, counseling, etc. So that's why it will never be the same, but it can add quite a bit.
Yeah, that's great. That's very well put. If anybody in our audience has any questions for our panelists, type them into the chat box, and we'll get to them if we can. So, Craig, I'm interested in kind of your own personal journey in terms of how did you develop an interest in this area?
Yeah, so years ago, about 16 years ago now, I had a mental health crisis in my family, where a dear loved one of mine was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And very often when you meet people in the mental and behavioral health space, they've got a story. I think very few people come into this space voluntarily. You kind of get pulled into it. And so in that time, I've received a lot of support from NAMI and the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and have engaged with them as a board member, educator, so forth, so on here locally. I've actually, because I've worked both in the US and overseas, have been able to develop a global network around this area of mental health. Even now, I'm working on my degree at King's College London. And so I have a real vision, I would say, for maximizing or assuring what I'm going to call a responsible maximal adoption of digital technology.
Responsible maximal adoption, yeah. Okay.
So the greatest number of people benefiting from their possession of a smartphone or other digital device to support not just their ability to work and shop, too much of that going on, but to support their ability to be healthier and resilient. There's a huge amount of potential that we haven't tapped into yet when it comes to this potential. And I would dare say that even more so for the less wealthy. So much of what we're doing in digital health has been designed and developed for high income populations and communities. But the less wealthy, though, stand to gain a lot from this. And we've talked about some of the issues, right? Equity, accessibility, overcoming stigma. The technology gives us a great deal of anonymity within communities to get help that we might not otherwise get. And then I would say community. I can tell you my own experience, my local community could do little for me when this crisis came up in my life and in my family. It was actually the ability to use technology to connect with other individuals and communities and families that I keep up even to this day, a decade and a half later, that's sustained, me and my family. So that's been my journey, and it is a journey that's the rest of my life at this point. Frankly, I went back to graduate school at 50 years old to retrain to be engaged in this space globally for the rest of my career, where I have to play for probably another 30, 35 years before I'm done.
That's awesome, Greg. Yeah, so my most profound encounter with these issues of equity and equity inclusion and access, with the fact that my kids went to elementary school with a bunch of wealthy white kids, and then a couple of years after they finished up that school, I got involved. Stanford. I was on the board of the Stanford School of Education, and as part of that, I got involved with a charter school that Stanford runs at East Palo Alto, which is kind of the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum in the Bay Area. And I learned a lot of things during that experience of having watched my kids at school in one end of the spectrum and working with this charter school at the other end of the spectrum. And one of the things I learned is that the school only has the kids for less than a third of the day, right? And so what happens the other 2/3 of the day actually has a huge impact on the academic outcomes. And kids that are struggling with emotional issues or that have things going on at home, they don't have any support. And I came to realize that when you look at kind of academic performance, that everybody focuses on better teachers, everybody focuses on smaller classroom size, everybody blames it on the teachers unions. But the reality is that a lot of it has to do with what's happening outside the classroom. And so, mental health is a huge component to this. And so I'm curious whether any of you have any experiences or thoughts on the topic we're discussing today with regard to school-age kids. Anybody have any experience with that? Thoughts on it?
So I'll mention one thing very, very quickly, but I'll be very succinct here. So, my research in the last year has focused a lot on what I'm going to call indigenous or pre-industrial mental health care.
Oh.
The fact is, we're all great-grandchildren of peoples who for millennia before the present industrial age took care of themselves, both physically and mentally, right?
Right.
And a lot of that was around the systemic conditions of good sleep, good relationship, diet, relaxation, and the fifth one gets away from me. Movement. Thank you. Exercise, right?
There you go. Yeah.
And what it is that in our modern society, in our drive for productivity and material comfort and all these sorts of things, we've allowed too much these conditions that make for healing from trauma, and we see the effect of it, and it's most profound on children. And we see this in the research by Vanderkolk around ACEs, or adverse childhood events, right? Which becomes a lifelong predictor of the experience of trauma and how that then has an impact on we and, as an extension, our families and communities. So I think that we've reached a certain tipping point where we've neglected, and now we can see a profound global effect. And, for better or worse, human beings respond under crisis. We kind of ignore things until it's a crisis, right?
Right.
And so the crisis is upon us, but in that crisis is a huge opportunity for us to now help our children. I'm a recent grandfather, and so I feel this even more keenly now that I'm looking at my grandbaby, as distinct from when, as you said, Brett, we were just working and looking at our children. So I'll stop at that and let others speak.
Yeah.
Brett, to speak to what you were speaking to,
Marla.
my mother worked here in Chicago Public Schools, and she was an administrator. And so it was very interesting to be able to see what her students in the inner cities were going through. And I remember she and my father were adamant about us going to Catholic schools. And she said, even though the public schools provide more resources because of the funding, my mother's concern was what she was seeing that was happening with a lot of her students. And she did not want me and my sister to have to actually go through that. And so I remember actually going with my mom to a lot of her students' homes when she would go and, offer additional support or try to talk to parents. And so what you see here are the social and structural determinants of health. So, what people are born into and where they're born into, how that impacts their lives, and it impacts the resources, and it also impacts their mental thought process, because again, you don't know what you don't know. So when I look at what those children were going through, I understand that based upon those structural and social determinants of health. And I remember my mother saying, I bring you here to school on the days that you have off because I want you to understand what other people are going through and what they are dealing with, so that you never take for granted what you have and how life looks very different for different people based upon their socioeconomics and different things that are happening in their lives because of where we were growing up and what we were experiencing and what was different. And that was one of the things that I thought was so powerful, because oftentimes what I find is different is that from a mental health perspective, what people look at is based upon what my socioeconomic level is. I may not need that mental health support, but that's not necessarily true, because what we notice on the CTI, for example, we have some of the most poorest residents to the most wealthiest, but yet people need mental health support from various different perspectives. So you even have CEOs that are afraid to go and see someone because they look at it like, people think, well, you're a CEO, you should not need mental health support. How could you then run a company? But then people who are at different levels feeling as though I can't go because the stigma, or again, someone is going to talk down to me. So there's various different reasons why people feel as though they can't get that support. So one of the things that really resonated with me when Marie reached out after the article in the Chicago Tribune, that I felt it was just imperative that I bring what she was doing to our staff, is because the staff that we have want to make it imperative that whatever way they can help, it's not just with the resources that we could provide the COVID residents, but it was also saying, if we can help during this testing phase of what she's trying to do and to offer our support, our staff believed in it, because many of them themselves were dealing with various mental health situations, and they wanted to make sure whatever we can do to help with an application like this, it was very important. And I know for myself personally, I have had a variety of different family members who've gone through various mental health crises. Myself, I was going through a major mental health crisis when I was getting my graduate degree. And it was the hardest thing because, again, people look at where you are, what you've done, what you've accomplished. And so they don't feel as though you should need that type of support. And it's hard talking to people because what's happening on the outside, or where you live, or what your accomplishments are, many people oftentimes don't feel that you're having a mental health crisis or you need that mental health support. So it makes people going through that feel as though they can't necessarily talk to people. And that's, to me, where a digital platform can help them in the interim until they might be able to get that other support. So I tell people, you need your mental health toolbox of resources that can help you get through.
I can speak to the issue with mental health and with children from my own personal experience dealing with for over 10 years trying to get help for a family member. There just aren't enough services, and what services are available are often limited to what insurance you have, and that is a huge barrier. But then also the fact that, it was mentioned at the top of the hour, there just aren't enough therapists out there. And then when you try to get a therapist for somebody who is under the age of 18, that adds to the difficulty, because there are very, very few of those. Most people will not take on somebody of that age. And I spent over 10 years, and I'm still fighting to this day to get services for one of my children. And I think with what Maria's created, one of the positive things that we've been talking about is that, if you can get this into the hands of children, they're always on their phones. It's something that could be discreet, a way for them to realize that, there is help out there. The schools are not doing the job. I'm sorry. They're just not being able to keep up. And because of the fact that, there's so many kids and so many few counselors, that by the time they recognize it, it's too late. And it needs to start sooner. Recognizing that somebody's had an exposure to trauma or is dealing with the things that, teenagers deal with on top of a trauma. If you don't get to that as soon as that happens, by the time they're in high school, it's sometimes it's too late. The damage is already done. And it goes back to what everybody was saying earlier with regards to the stigma. It's not something that people talk about. When you put on, nobody goes on Facebook and says, my child is having a mental breakdown, and then everybody signs up for, let's bring food to, help out. That's just not done. And that's not to say that other people aren't going through very serious things, such as cancer and leukemia and things like that. But you'll notice that there's a huge difference and a huge stigma associated with mental health. You put on Facebook or social media that your child is in the hospital because of cancer and the community rallies around you. It's not the case with mental health. They tend to ostracize you. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with your child. And having been going through that for over 10 years, it's very difficult. So that's why I'm so excited about this new opportunity.
So Yuval, somebody in our audience asks about generational trauma coupled with dysfunction that makes it get transferred from one generation to the next. Is that a thing, Yuval?
Yeah, actually yes, unfortunately. There are good studies that have been done on Holocaust survivors and their second generation, and they found that the exposure to trauma among parents really kind of set up the kids to display all sorts of sensitivities and vulnerabilities and to mental health problems.
Yeah.
There are also good studies documenting that among mothers and fathers and grandparents with depression, there is an ongoing kind of generational impact into first, second, and third generations. So it's there. Now, I think that's kind of connects me a little bit towards the panel spoke about the last 10 minutes or so, and I really like the physical exercise, sleep, and nutrition algorithm, but I will add to it also social support or mental health support, right? I mean, human beings need each other. They need each other always. They need to be in touch, but they need each other even more in times of stress, right? So, so this is really, and it's crucial. And if people don't have that, they may develop depression. They may feel lonely. Eventually, they will self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, and eventually even consider suicide. And there are multiple studies really suggesting that.
Right. Jackie writes in and points out that sometimes there's an issue of equity and access with regard to access to technology, and that is certainly true. I think probably the thing that's changed that is that today everybody's got a mobile phone. Even the disadvantaged people have a mobile phone, so it's probably slightly better than it used to be, but it's still absolutely true that not.
I recently came back from a visit in Africa, and in the countries that I went to visit for work issues, to my surprise, there was also one psychiatrist, and he was also retired, right? So it's true that technology is still lacking, but if you compare it to availability of mental health professionals, there is no comparison.
Right. Or if you compare it to internet access, 10 years ago, 10 years ago there was definitely a digital divide there, as they called it. It's probably less true today, although it still exists. Craig?
No,
Craig?
actually, Brett, it's not less true today.
Is that right? Okay.
What the pandemic has shown us that is actually exasperated
Is that right? Okay. So the digital divide is still a thing.
and growing. And I want to emphasize and growing.
Interesting.
Although you do see more and more local and to some degree the federal government, there was a lot of funding in recent acts that have been passed that are working to remedy this issue of data scarcity and device scarcity. But I think it's also important to call out that same as we've been educated to use our digital technology again for work and shopping, right? There's an educational process that needs to be stepped up in terms of us using it for health. And what that's about is literacy. That we need to develop what I'm going to call digital health literacy within populations so that they know how to use the tools to build the house of their health, not just breaking windows, which is what we hear most about, right? Addictions and how it stresses us out. But it's just as capable of giving us an ability to be in community, to be more resilient, and to know how to do the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves.
And to piggyback off of what Fred's saying, that's actually what we're doing right now with a lot of the funding that we're receiving in Cook County, is that we're putting programs together for health literacy. We're putting programs together to try to make sure that the health literacy we're putting out, it's actually speaking in terms of the different languages for the different populations that we serve. And we're meeting with different community-based organizations to figure out what types of programs will help in those communities. And to his point, we recognize that when it came to vaccines, how do you get the vaccines out there? So when you're thinking about different countries and people said, oh, they didn't want the vaccine, that's not what the issue was. The issue was them having the capability of actually storing the vaccines so that it would be viable for those particular communities. So
that's right. It's got specific storage requirements.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's what we're trying to also figure out. And when the person spoke about the generational trauma, that's the other thing that a lot of people have to recognize, is that different cultural groups have experienced different types of generational trauma. And so oftentimes they don't realize why they might respond to things. And this is another thing when we were talking about trauma-informed care, why you might react and respond a certain way predicated upon generational traumas. And so this is where the epigenetics comes into play and things of that nature. So it all ties in together, predicated upon different things that different cultural groups have gone through.
So can I piggyback on that very quickly?
Yeah.
We talk about generational trauma. We should increasingly become sensitive to then talking about generational healing. Because the fact is, we're all alive because we are the grandchildren of people who, in experiencing the trauma of the human experience, they also understood how to heal. Yeah. So, I look forward to a day where the same way that today we know that when you get a cut or a bruise, you need antiseptic, a bandage, or ice. I look forward to the day that we understand that when I'm traumatized, every day I get a cut or a bruise in my soul, that I know just as readily that I need to eat better, sleep better, relax, get into some community, and heal. Not only for myself, but for the generations, right? So I'll leave it at that. I can go on and on about this,
Those are great words, Craig. So we're just about out of time, but I'd like to, Marie, I'd love for you to kind of finish us off here by give us an idea of where you think the trend lines are going. In other words, you're currently CEO of a company that is using technology for mental health recovery. Healing, to use Craig's words, and there's a lot of exciting stuff going on as we've discussed today. And where do what are the trend lines, do you think? Where's this all going to be in 5 years?
So first of all, before I answer this, and it's kind of part of the question, but when we talk about the ACE and the adverse childhood experience and all of this, I guess I want to give an idea of hope, right? It's not because you were born in those families, and as opposed to a nice cushion childhood that you can't make it, right? I mean, resilience can be learned, right? We all have, I know there are social determinants of health and I know there are genetic reasons, but I think with the right social network around you and the right tools, you can outgrow all of this. And I've seen a lot of people who have gone in very difficult situations and they became very resilient, and now they are some of the most, happy and helpful people in the world. So I think this is very important, and this is very important for teenagers who are in difficult situations right now. So this is one. And then two, what is beautiful about technology, and that kind of answers your question, is that, people spend a lot of time with their phone, right? And what is interesting is technology is starting to track. And so for teenagers, especially because you have a shortage of therapists, right? And a lot of them are diagnosed too late, right? And we've seen the suicide rate among teenagers growing like crazy. I mean, Stanford, the other day I was talking to a Stanford alum. I mean, 4 people committed suicide at Stanford last year, right? I mean, it's on the rise everywhere, independently of socioeconomic upbringing, right? So, and those people, you can most probably detect the early sign. I mean, Yuval could talk more about this, but right now you see technologies that can track voice, for example, and detect depression early on, right? And so I think this is going to be the future, is very, very, very early on. Technology is going to say, hey, you might have a risk to develop depression. You might have, and we see it with Alzheimer, right? I mean, this is another topic, but right now they're using voice and saying, you have a risk of maybe developing Alzheimer 15 years down the road. If you detect it early, you can heal it. If you detect it too late, it's too late, right? So early detection is going to be the trend. That's one. And two, it's going to be tailored. I mean, the problem is that a lot of the therapies out there, it's a fixed therapy, right? You enter the process, even with the EMDR, this is the protocol. You go into the protocol, right? And some people are like, yeah, but I like 50% of it, but I don't like 50% of it. But the therapist is like, well, this is the protocol, right? So you're going to have solutions that are going to be tailored to people. The same way when you get your phone, right? The first thing people do is they tailor it, right? They change all the colors, all the background, everything, and now it becomes their buddy, right? So it's going to be the same thing with apps. People are going to say, I like this, I don't like this. I want my Peloton at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I hate it after lunch, right? So it's going to be a buddy. It's kind of going to replace a little bit the social network that in the past was there for people. I mean, little funny story, they did studies with the people of Okinawa, right, who can live, those women can live up to 120 years old. And they realized the one factor, they thought it was food, but the one factor is social relationship, right? Mm-hmm. They all spend time in the afternoon and they process and, they talk. And so a phone is going to be part of it. It's not going to replace friends, but it's going to be there for people when they need help, so.
Terrific. Well, this has been a really great conversation. I have a feeling that the 6 of us could keep talking for a while. There's nothing I love better than hanging out with a bunch of smart, interesting people. So thank you so much for joining Marla, Michelle, Yuval, Craig, and Marie. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. And for those in our audience, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Be well.